Why people stop listening. Attention moves toward expected return and away from felt cost, and conversational space follows the same rule without needing enforcement. In groups, people test for value fast, using small signals like time to point, clarity at stake, and the ratio of detail to relevance, and they adjust their listening with almost no internal debate. A speaker who crosses certain thresholds produces a predictable shift, because the audience begins estimating losses, not gains, and the body acts before the mind frames it in language. The eyes avert, the hands move, the note field closes. The head nod remains while the internal channel shuts down, and the group keeps the veneer of respect while withdrawing the resource that mattered. That resource is not permission to speak, but the willingness to let speech change anything. And once that level is withheld, the interaction keeps its shape while losing its effect. The pattern forms through miscalibration that starts small and compounds. A person learns that more information preempts criticism, that certainty looks like leadership, that time taken signals commitment, and that silence from others can be treated as consent. And these lessons feel real because there were moments when they worked. The person who over-explains usually does it because they felt exposed once, and now they mistake saturation for safety, and the extra detail produces a temporary sense of control. The person who restates the same point believes the problem is not the point, but the other's attention span, and repetition feels like duty. The person who moralizes sees deviation as threat, not disagreement, and speaks as if clarity will force alignment. Each move carries inner justification that is emotionally steady and cognitively cheap. So nothing in the moment signals cost except the subtle withdrawal of others, which is easy to misread as patience or respect rather than disengagement. People stop giving them their full attention. Inside the pattern, signals are inverted. Nods and brief affirmations are taken as agreement when they are actually release valves, and questions are treated as openings when they are often used as timers to end the exchange. Long pauses are interpreted as processing rather than resistance. Silence in a meeting is treated as alignment rather than a decision to avoid friction, and a lack of explicit objections becomes mistaken for consent, which lets the speaker build on imagined buy-in. The absence of interruption looks like endorsement only to the person filling the space, because everyone else feels the low return and chooses quiet exit over visible pushback. The incentives support the mistake. The speaker receives immediate relief from uncertainty by saying more, while listeners accrue small burdens with no compensation, and social norms discourage clear signals of retreat. A manager avoids confrontation by letting the monologue run, and peers stop asking follow-up questions because they have learned that every answer doubles the length of the exchange. The person who keeps talking feels moral because they think they are protecting truth, process, or team outcomes, and this reduces any discomfort they might have felt about taking the room. The more convinced the speaker is that the content matters, the less likely they are to see the relational cost, because urgency anesthetizes perception of loss outside the self. The structure of modern communication intensifies the gap. Threads, channels, and inboxes allow people to mute without visible refusal, and platforms reward short reactions that look like attention but require none. A visible count, a quick emoji, a polite thanks gives the speaker a trace of acknowledgement that can be misread as impact. Meetings on video allow a camera on face to conceal disengagement, and a standardized set of phrases like, "Let's park this," or "We can circle back," provides exits that keep the surface intact while the substance dies. As these tools accumulate, the environment enables extraction of the speaker's energy without giving the thing they want, which is future attention that stays open long enough to change behavior. Their voice becomes easy to ignore. Mechanically, people stop listening when the burden of integration exceeds the expected payoff. The brain triages inputs and privileges novelty, precision, and risk control, and it discards sources that degrade these metrics. Redundant points signal no new payoff, Hedging language signals low confidence, absolute language signals rigidity, and excess context signals unclear aim. Each cue tells the listener that continuing will not pay. Any ambiguity around stake, who is affected, when, and how forces extra work that listeners will not do when other sources compete for the same resource. When a speaker routinely imposes this cost, the group adapts by minimizing exposure, and the quiet cutoff becomes standard practice. From inside, the spiral feels justified. The person senses drift and tries to close the gap by adding more proof, more examples, more qualifiers, believing that the failure was insufficient clarity rather than a mismatch between format and attention. They double down on what they can control, which is volume and time, rather than revising the model that created the drift. This creates a loop. The longer they speak without effect, the more effort they invest to justify having spoken so long, which keeps them tied to the original mistake. Sunk cost acts on speech the way it acts on projects, and withdrawal becomes more painful than continuation. So the speaker persists and feels principled, while the room withdraws and feels bored or strained. The misread signals are consistent across settings. A polite email reply that says, "Good points," is treated as a green light when it is a way to end a thread. A reschedule is seen as continued interest when it is a delay tactic used to dilute momentum. A warm tone in a one-on-one is seen as belief in the content when it is an attempt to maintain social ease while declining the substance. People who need to appease a superior will absorb the speech and then avoid the projects that would load them with the costs implicit in the content, and the speaker will interpret the silence as progress. This pattern becomes self-protective for listeners. Confrontation has social risk and future consequences, while disengagement has neither, so people choose withdrawal that looks like accommodation. In organizations, deference scripts allow people to appear aligned while redirecting attention elsewhere, and no one needs to say anything direct. The speaker imagines that their consistency proves seriousness, and they fail to see that consistency has become a signal of non-adaptability, which lowers expected return for future attention. The more a person insists on taking the long route to a point, the more others adopt shortcuts around that person. Internal narratives mask the loss. People who speak this way think of themselves as principled, thorough, honest, or brave, which makes the immediate feedback from disengagement feel like evidence of others' avoidance rather than a cost incurred by their own delivery. They fill in the silence with stories about bias, politics, or fear in the room, and these stories are easier to hold than the idea that their speech no longer earns the resource it requests. The louder the internal moral story, the less visible the external shift in power, and the gap remains stable because neither side has incentive to bridge it. Their words no longer move decisions. Status interacts with this mechanism in predictable ways. People will endure more from high-status sources, but the threshold still exists. And when the ratio breaks, even status loses the cushion of assumed value. Subordinates will provide polite echo, while peers with alternatives will reallocate attention and effort toward people who offer clearer returns. And after a short period, the status effect erodes under the weight of reduced influence. What remains looks like deference from a distance, but the real decisions move elsewhere. A reputation for long or heavy speech deters early input from others, which then forces later speech to be longer and heavier to make up for missed timing, and the cycle locks. Over time, the habit becomes part of identity. A person comes to see themselves as the one who clarifies, who guards standards, who keeps the group honest, and they become predictable in ways that allow others to root around them. Predictability invites preemptive withdrawal because the cost is known and can be budgeted out. The content may still be correct, but correctness without bounded delivery does not attract attention. And in practice, the line between correctness and usefulness collapses. Listeners act on expected usefulness, not abstract correctness, and they test sources by remembered fatigue, not by technical merit, especially under time pressure. Nothing about this feels like failure from the inside. The speaker sees a shrinking number of people who still engage and treats them as the real audience, while the rest become cautionary examples, used to reinforce the habit. The remaining audience shrinks further, and the person reads this as proof that only a select few can handle the truth or the process, which protects self-image while isolating them from broader influence. Each small withdrawal by others becomes invisible or rationalized, and the person continues with confidence even as their reach declines. Observers are not hiding a secret. They are following the easiest path. It is easier to nod and disengage than to correct the speaker, because the latter creates friction and liability, and no one is paid to fix someone else's delivery. The group treats the speaker's traits as stable, and they adjust their own behavior around those traits, rather than seeking to change them. This produces the outward view that everything is fine, while underneath the actual attention moves on. The mechanism does not reverse on its own, because each side has routines that work well enough for them in the short term. Once the pattern is established, observers change what they think they are seeing. The person is no longer treated as a source of actionable input, but as a predictable time sink that has to be managed, and their presence becomes a variable in planning rather than a resource. People recalibrate expectations downward and begin to prepare containment strategies before the person even speaks, because the model is now fixed in memory and gets applied automatically. The label that forms is quiet and steady, not a villain, not a threat, simply costly to engage for any task where time and attention are finite. This label spreads by small acts, not by announcement, and the shift is complete without a single open conflict. Calendars exclude them from key meetings. Respect reallocates silently. Colleagues who once asked for their view now ask someone else whose input is shorter, more bounded, or easier to apply. And the social justification for this shift sounds polite, while the resource move is absolute. Decisions that require speed are made in smaller groups that exclude the person, because their presence is assumed to slow the process. And later, the formal group is informed. The person's title might remain, and they might still speak at length when allowed, yet the real choices occur without them, and the minimal summary they receive afterwards gives the appearance of inclusion. Over time, others start to assume the person will argue, or repeat, or delay, and the assumption functions like a forecast that keeps becoming true. This reallocation looks like normal logistics. A meeting is split into two parts, with the person invited to the non-decision portion, and the critical section framed as a time constraint that just happens to conflict. A document is circulated after the last window for material changes has already passed, so comments cannot affect the path, and the writer can always say that feedback was considered. Channels develop where the person is not present, and they become the default place for work that needs movement without friction. Nothing requires a confrontation, because people respond to their own incentives, and the collective outcome emerges from many small choices. The person is reinterpreted as ceremonial in some contexts. They are asked to present, or to speak to culture, or to explain a history that no longer drives choices. And these roles consume hours without changing a line on a plan. When they push into the actual decision space, others defer in the moment and undo the effect later, or they route formally through a procedure that neutralizes the input. People learn what type of content draws the person in, and avoid those areas when they need speed, and they involve them when they need a delay for other reasons. The person becomes a tool for slowing down work when slowing down benefits someone else, which is a form of use that looks like respect until results are inspected. Their authority moves to the concise person. Outside observers update reputations by memory of effort, not content accuracy. When someone consistently requires more time than the perceived benefit, they move down the list during any triage event, whether that is a hiring discussion, a budget cut, or a seat allocation. References become faint, endorsements become lukewarm, and the language used about them shifts toward adjectives like thorough, passionate, or principled, which function as polite substitutes for low influence in actual operations. People who once depended on them find replacements by habit, and when a new project starts, the default names listed do not include them. Their presence triggers preparation that centers on minimizing exposure rather than enabling output. Email patterns show the change without needing analysis. Messages that would have gone to them now go to someone else with a short note to keep them in the loop, while the real loop exists in a separate thread. Their long messages are met with quick acknowledgments that create a record without creating obligation, and others reply among themselves, where replies can be short and directive. When they join the smaller thread, the tone shifts and the energy drains, and the group moves again when the person stops posting. The archive tells a story that requires no interpretation. Replies get faster when their name is absent. People loop them in after decisions are made. Opportunity cost compounds. The environment treats their participation as a risk to velocity. So event organizers, project leads, and gatekeepers stop exposing mission-critical work to that risk, and the person's exposure to meaningful tasks falls. As exposure drops, so does the chance to produce visible outcomes, which further reduces others' willingness to include them. And soon the only items available are low stakes or late stage. From the outside, it looks like a fair distribution of work based on fit and bandwidth, but the underlying driver is the memory of high cost. By the time this distribution is stable, nothing needs to be said. Low friction becomes the strongest currency, and the person lacks it. Others develop shorthand communication styles with one another that allow quick passes, and the person is excluded from those loops because their involvement breaks the speed. When choices must be defended, the person's presence is used as proof that due process was followed, while everyone knows the substance was decided out of reach. They become visible at the wrong moments and invisible at the right ones, a pattern that preserves optics and erodes impact. The mismatch grows and becomes a fact of the environment. Stakeholders outside the immediate circle adjust as well. Clients learn which names produce movement and which produce delay, and they stop asking for the latter, even if the latter holds formal authority. Partners direct requests away from the person toward others with faster turnaround, and this redirection becomes muscle memory. New hires absorb the pattern without being told, because they experience where decisions happen and copy the behaviors that get access. The person's reputation reaches them already filtered through this distribution, and they internalize it without malice. The person's ideas begin to show up with different names attached. This does not require theft. It requires only retelling by someone whose speech does not tax the room. When that retelling occurs, the group credits the mover, not the origin, and over time, the record of contribution shifts. The person notices the similarity and explains it as politics, which is accurate at one level and irrelevant at the level of outcomes. Influence is recorded by movement, not by source claims, and movement has left their channel. Feedback stays indirect. When they ask for impressions, people say something that can end the exchange without consequence, and the person treats it as mixed or minor rather than definitive. Performance processes produce language that signals reduction while maintaining deniability, and the person focuses on the wording rather than the effect. Over cycles, this language becomes the norm used to describe them in rooms they do not enter, and the conclusions are already reached before any formal step is required. The social system resists explicit feedback because explicit feedback costs the giver, and the system does not need it to enforce the outcome. Metrics serve the same function. Response rates decline, meeting slots shorten, attendance drops, and audience retention on any recorded content falls into predictable curves that people learn without reporting them. The person may argue content quality or external factors, but the system responds only to the patterns that conserve effort, and those patterns become consistent. When resource allocation decisions appear, the historical data justifies exclusion, and no intention or plea changes the model that formed. Budgets follow attention, and attention has already moved. Status lingers in the profile longer than in the room. Titles, awards, or past wins create an impression for outsiders that the person still carries weight. But inside the system, people interact with the current cost of engagement, not with the resume. The cosmetic signals give the person a reason to believe that nothing important has shifted, and this belief delays recognition while the practical shifts consolidate. Outsiders who rely on surface signals will be surprised when their expectations are not met, but insiders will not, because they have already adjusted. The gap between appearance and effect becomes stable. The group does not punish. It edits. It removes the person from the steps where cost exceeds return and places them where their speech produces no risk, and the edit persists without discussion. When friction rises around them, the group reroutes, and the new path turns into the habit. No single act looks decisive, yet the aggregation of small choices produces a boundary that the person does not cross. The distribution of power reflects that boundary long after anyone stops thinking about it. Over time, the person's presence signals a narrow set of outcomes. People in the room prepare for a block of time that will not change their work, and they brace without making a scene. Invisible agreements form about who will absorb the time and who will steer back to the agenda, and those agreements operate smoothly. Afterward, the room continues as if nothing happened, because nothing did in terms of decisions. The person may feel accomplished, and that feeling does not translate into movement elsewhere. Their network thins in ways that feel ambiguous. Messages go unanswered a little longer each quarter. Delays stretch beyond plausible constraints, and routine collaborations migrate to people seen as low-cost channels. Invites to ad hoc sessions stop arriving, because the sessions themselves happen around lunch tables, in hallways, or inside chat groups that never included them. Those shifts are hard to prove and easy to feel, and by the time they are obvious, they have been in place for months. What remains is the structure that holds the person while excluding their influence. Eventually, outcomes become predictable. If the person joins a meeting, the plan adjusts to absorb the delay, and the decision is made elsewhere ahead of time. If they send a long message, the replies will be polite and non-committal, and progress will continue along the path set before the message arrived. If they raise a point late, it will be recorded and filed without changing the next step, and the memory of this will guide future behavior without anyone naming it. The cycle maintains itself because it costs less than breaking it. Nothing interrupts this without a larger shock. The environment continues to optimize for speed and clarity, and the person continues to feel justified, and the gap keeps producing the same distribution of attention. Others do not confront because they do not need to, and the person does not change because they do not feel the immediate penalty. The result is not dramatic. It is routine, and routine is the end state of most social systems. The path that began with small misreads ends here and stays,